Now, verse 5, Paul says, "Now I consider myself in no way inferior to those super apostles." The term there is above exceeding, or very chiefest, one old translator called. They are the best of the apostles. There's one of two things he could be referring to here. He could be referring to like Peter and James, right? The guys that were known to be the leaders. He could be referring to them, but he is so rich in sarcasm at this point that he's probably talking about these other teachers, that they just think that they're so cool. And he says, I'm not inferior to the guys who think they're so cool. Verse 6, even if I am untrained in public speaking, I am certainly not untrained in knowledge. And that's the truth. You know, it's really interesting that Paul doesn't talk about his education here in chapter 11 at all. He's about to give us his cover letter or his resume, and he doesn't mention his education at all. I would. He was trained by Gamaliel. He is the leader of the educational system in Jerusalem. I mean, he's the leader of the temple education system. He was trained as though to take his place one day. Paul was guaranteed a lifetime seat in the Sanhedrin. That would be like a combination between their Supreme Court and their legislature altogether. I mean, he had everything going for him. He, I'm sure, was wealthy and powerful, but he had an amazing education, tremendous training that none of these super apostles could even touch. But Paul doesn't bring it up. He says, yeah, I'm not trained in public speaking. I didn't take oration classes. He says, basically, instead, I'm not untrained in knowledge. So the idea is, well, those Jerrys were taking public speaking. I was learning my way around the Bible, is essentially what he's saying there. Indeed, we have in every way made that clear to you in everything. You can see it. No, I'm not a trained public speaker, but I have opened the Bible to you. You can see it. Remember, he was with them for a year and a half. He walked them through chapter by chapter, verse by verse. He let them understand how the whole thing works together with Christ. He says, verse 7, or did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you might be exalted? Because I preached the gospel to you free of charge. Remember, we talked about these other guys are big and rich and look it, and they're saying that Paul ought to be that way too. And since he's not, you get what you pay for. He said, was that a sin? Did I sin against you? Did I cause rebellion or dissension in your ranks because I did it for free, because I didn't charge you something? Verse 8, I robbed other churches by taking pay from them to minister to you. The word that they use for robbed there might be more literally plundered. I plundered other churches. Again, he's speaking in great sarcasm, but what he's saying is, I let other churches pay me money so that I didn't have to have you pay me money. And remember, he talks about this in his letter to the Philippians. He talks quite a bit about how the Macedonian churches had paid for him. If you remember when he first got, Acts 17, when he first got to Corinth, coming out of Athens, and he was so beat up, just feeling like nothing was working right. When he got there, he did two things. The first thing was he determined to preach nothing among them except Christ crucified. He wasn't going to talk about any big fancy stuff. He was just going to tell them about Jesus. And number two, he went to work. He started making tents. Again, that was his trade. He worked with leather. He sewed leather. He must have had some gnarly calluses on his hands, working with leather, sewing leather, and that sort of thing. He went back to work, and then when his crew showed up from Macedonia, they brought gifts from the Macedonian churches with them that allowed Paul to go full time. So he started there in Corinth bivocational. He eventually went full time, not because the church in Corinth could pay for him, but because he was paid by other churches. Now keep in mind, pause, that he had the right to tell them to pay him. He had that right. He talks about that in a couple of different epistles. He had every right. If the minister who brings the gospel ought to be funded by the gospel, he tells Timothy. He could have told them, I'm here telling you the way that it is, and I need you guys to rent me an apartment, and I need you guys to make sure I have meals and the things that I need. But he didn't. He allowed himself to be supported by others and by his own hands. Verse 9, he says, when I was present with you and in need, I didn't burden anyone, since the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my needs. I have kept myself and will keep myself from burdening you in any way. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. So he says, this is what I've done. I'm going to continue to do that. This is how I have been doing things in your region, and I'm not going to change. Nobody's going to be able to say, I paid Paul to come and preach to me. Why? Because I don't love you, he says. The people were saying, the false teachers that were coming around were saying the reason that Paul is not taking money from you is because he doesn't love you. Now you're going to start to see, as we go through this, that these false teachers were remarkably abusive. They were emotionally and physically abusive to the people. You're going to see a pattern if you've ever what came to my mind in the line of work that I'm in, if you've ever dealt with a woman who has been in a marriage relationship with an abusive husband, or a young lady who is in a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship with an abusive boy, you're going to see that pattern in these false teachers. And so they're telling the people things like, because I love you, I'm taking your money. If I didn't love you, I wouldn't take your money. But because I love you, I'm willing to take your money. You see, can you hear it? Paul says, they're saying that I didn't take your money because I don't love you. He says, God knows I do. And the implication there in his rich sarcasm is that you know as well, you Corinthian people, that I love you. Now, we know what agape love is. And one real way to define agape love is it's the deepest form of giving. There's no taking in agape love. It's the deepest form of giving. Paul says, you don't think that I've exercised within you the deepest form of giving by not taking from you? Think it through, guys, he says to them. Think it through. We'll get to verse 20. We'll keep going so you can see what I'm talking about. Verse 12. But I will continue to do what I'm doing in order to deny an opportunity those who want to be regarded as our equals in what they boast about. In other words, I'm going to keep on doing things this way. I'm going to keep on not charging to preach. Now, these other guys that are coming along, let's see if they can do the same thing. They claim to be equals with me. Let's see if they can do the same thing. They claim to be better than me. Let's see if they can do what I do and not charge for teaching. One commentator, I think it was Corson, said, this is the real test of ministry. What do you do when the money's not there? This is the real test. When you hire somebody to come be in ministry for you and there's no money there, what happens? If they felt like God was calling them to this ministry, they felt like God was calling them to come and serve, they agreed with God to come and serve, and then found out there was no money there. Or they agreed to come and serve and were given a salary to begin with, but because of economic situations, whatever the case may be, there isn't money. Do they stay? This is the real test of a minister, Corson says. I appreciate that. Now, I understand that we all need to make a living to some extent. But, when you're a pastor, your boss is God, and not the church board. The church board's boss is God too. And when he calls you to come somewhere, you go. I remember hearing from a particular teaching pastor who was teaching other pastors that throughout his career he had moved churches quite a bit, like used to be the case a generation ago. You'd be in a church for 4 or 5 years and move to another one. That used to be the way it was. And he would hear a call from another church, and they would say, okay, pastor, we want to see if you can come for an interview. Let us tell you about the package we have available. And he'd say, no, I don't want to know. I don't want you to use your package to lure me to come to your church. I don't want to know. What we're going to do is we're going to pray about this thing for a while. And if God says go, we go. I thought that was a really good idea. When I was younger, I thought, well, that was really dumb. Because how in the world is he going to know if they can afford to take care of his family, his children, stuff like that? I mean, what if he gets there and they can't even afford to have a place for him to live? What's he going to do? But interestingly enough, 2 times I've been called by a church to go. And honestly, the first time we were told we had been praying about it, and the district superintendent volunteered to us. They don't have any money. There is no budget. Wait a minute, you get paid for doing this? Okay. We prayed about it and decided to go, and they did pay. They did pay. Now, when we were coming here, I remember when we had our first interview, Ed mentioned that the money wasn't very good. And we'd prayed up to the interview point. And we prayed about it, and I thought, well, it's going to be fine. And honestly, it is fine. But I remember Ed saying, and I'm not trying to boast about myself here. I'm just trying to tell you the process. I remember Ed saying, I don't know if the church is going to be able to provide enough in housing for you guys to have a place to live. Now, it was substantially more than we'd had in Sweet Home, Oregon, but real estate is substantially more in Mount Vernon, Washington. And I remember us talking about it and all just agreeing, it's going to be fine, Ed. It's going to be just fine. And before we even received the housing allowance, Wendy and I sat down, well, let's put it this way. Wendy sat down and made a list of everything we needed in a house. And she detailed even the kind of flooring she wanted to have. She detailed it all out. And I said, let's make this list and let's give it to the church board to pray about, and let's just let God provide. And they said, well, we have some money if you want to come and do a house hunting trip. We can pay and you can come up and stay up here and do a house hunting trip. And we said, no. Let's just pray about it and let God provide. Because if he's calling us up here, he's going to have to take care of these details. And so we prayed about it. And it was really an interesting list. I mean, I don't know if you guys know, but I have an extra vehicle or two. And maybe they don't always work. And so we were going to need a place that we could house these things. And then Hayden was really getting into fixing things. So we needed some kind of shed where Hayden could be fixing things. And of course we had the dog, so we needed a fully fenced yard. And Wendy wanted multiple levels. She didn't want to be on the same level. And she really wanted either a fireplace or a wood stove on both levels. As well as, like a natural gas furnace. I mean, it was really quite the list, honestly.
I wanted a gas range.
And a gas stove. That's right. She said she wanted a gas stove. I'll admit to you right now, I was slightly embarrassed when I got the list. I was like, you want me to ask them for this? And she was like, yep, that's what we're going to pray about. And I said, yes, ma'am. And I sent that off to the church board, and we started praying. And wouldn't you know it, we're looking for a house, and I found this one for sale, and there was no price on it. And so I called the real estate agent and said, I'd like to know about this house. How much is it? And his answer to me was, why do you want to know about that house? And I said, well, it actually checks every single one of the boxes. Every box it checks. And he said, well, to make a long story short, the house is caught up in a legal dispute. If you could put some money on it by this Friday, you could get it for about $150,000 less than its value. I said, I'll be there Friday. Because that's just what God does. Of course, and it was him talking about this. He said, this is important for the young guys who are going into, gals who are going into ministry to realize. If you wouldn't do it for free, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Is really where it comes down to it. Because God's your boss, and he'll take much better care of you than anybody else could. Anyway, this is what Paul is saying there. I'm going to continue to do this to fund my ministry like I've been doing it, in order to deny an opportunity to those who want to be regarded as our equals in what they boast about. Let them live on faith, Paul says. I'm living on faith, not paycheck, faith. Let them try. Verse 13. Well, I'm going to read 13 through 15 together, and then we'll break it down. For such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no great surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will be according to their works. Man, that's some serious stuff. Such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves. Actually, I like to use the term there, transforming themselves. It's more of the King James look at it there. Transforming themselves as apostles of Christ. You know what's really interesting? For every amazing thing that Christ does for you, Satan has a counterfeit. For every amazing thing that Christ gives you, Satan has a counterfeit. And sometimes the counterfeit looks really good. Sometimes, to begin with, it even looks better than the real thing. Have you guys ever seen them do a photo shoot for one of those food commercials? You know those pictures of the food that's on TV? It's not real food. I saw one where they were doing pumpkin pie and they had to have the whipped cream on there. And the whipped cream had to look just so, right? It's got to be the round and the little dollop and the woo on top. They did it with shaving cream because they could form it the way that they wanted it to be. Have you seen the one with the tomato soup? And on the top of the tomato soup, there's a tomato floating and a cracker. Tomatoes don't float on tomato soup. First of all, it's not tomato soup. It's just the right color of some kind of substance. And then they put a little stand in there, and they gently set the tomato on the little stand so that it looks like it's floating in tomato soup. It's not even the real thing. It looks better than the real thing. The reason they do that, the reason the burger on TV looks so much better than the burger that comes in the box is because it's not real. But it's supposed to look better than the one that comes in the box, because if it was the one that comes in the box, you wouldn't go down and buy that. That's a mess. Some guy, or maybe a robot, making minimum wage, slapping that thing together, you're not going to buy that. But the one that comes in the box, on TV, that's fantastic, you see. This is what he's saying. They transform themselves. They disguise themselves. They're counterfeit. They try to look better than the real thing, but they're not. That is so important, and something I wish I would have understood as a young man. Because as a young man in your late teens, early 20s, learning to set out in life, there's a lot of stuff that looks really attractive. And most of it is not worth handling. The real thing is there. You have to know what the real thing is, and you have to know what the fake thing is to know your... I guess what I'm saying is you got to have some discernment. You got to understand what a real apostle is before you understand what a fake one is. You know, Wendy used to work for a bank, and she was pretty good at finding counterfeit money. You know, when it would come through, she could identify it. And the reason she could identify counterfeit money is not because she took classes on what counterfeit money looks like. It was because they did hours and hours and hours of training on what real money looks like. And since she knew what real money looks like, when somebody brought something in that wasn't real, she could tell immediately, ooh, something's up with that. That's what we're talking about here. They are false apostles, deceitful workers. They're not honest, they're not truthful, they're working lies, disguising themselves as apostle of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Do you guys remember the really heretical George Burns movie, Oh God, You Devil? Remember that? I came out when I was a kid. It was funny and cute, and I thought it was cool, but then I didn't understand the truth. But it was cute. In that movie, George Burns plays God, and George Burns also plays the devil. And when George Burns plays the devil, he is a sharp dresser. I mean, he's got like a really nice tailored suit, really good haircut. Everything about him is just right. His manners are real good, and he's just the classiest James Bond-esque kind of guy George Burns can be. When he plays God, he looks like an old fisherman. He's got like his fishing jacket on and just like a fishing hat. Smile, gentle, twinkle in his eye, super nice guy that you just love to spend all day with. But he was not a sharp dresser. He wasn't fancy looking. And I don't remember the name of the character, but the main character had been hanging out with the devil. and then met God and said, how can you be God? He looks so much better than you. And he said, yeah, he's always trying to copy me, was his answer. And that was it. I thought of that when I was looking at this. Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. The counterfeit's got to look better than the real thing, or you're not going to pay attention to it. Oh, we see this so often in life. Why do you think all these kids are out there hearing all of these stories about how good illicit sex is? Everybody should have a friend with benefits, and they're going out and trying it out because they hear it sounds fantastic, and then they're getting their hearts broken and their emotions messed up and their bodies abused, and then they're not whole. And they have to go through healing and PTSD treatment and drug treatment and all this other kind of stuff, and they're all depressed. And I mean, they've taken advantage of the counterfeit that looked so good to begin with. Oh, marriage, that sounds boring. Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. One thing that I got to thinking about that I probably shouldn't mention when I was reading this is the rainbow. The rainbow, which is the promise of God. It's the promise of grace, is what it is. The rainbow is the first promise of grace that honestly, from God's perspective, we people, we ought to just be zapped. Every inclination of our heart is only evil all the time. But because he loves us so much, he promises to deal with us patiently and with tremendous grace, calling to us to return to him. That's pretty cool. But now there's a counterfeit rainbow. And it says, everybody is just wonderful. Everybody's just wonderful, just the way you are. No need to change. No need to grow. No need to repent and return to God. You just keep going the way you are. You're just fine. Now, honestly, let's just be honest for a minute. That sounds a whole lot better than the only inclination of his heart is only evil all the time. I mean, that just doesn't sound fun. That sounds a whole lot better on the surface than repent, turn around, go the other direction, admit you've been wrong, admit you need something else. It's counterfeit. It's disguised as an angel of light. Listen, the road that you're going down will fulfill you eventually if you just go far enough. Well, I've been going on this road for a while and it's not fulfilling me yet. Well, just keep going. It will. Get deeper involved and it will fulfill you eventually. Well, now I'm deeper involved and I've paid money and I've had surgeries and I've gotten a new driver's license and I've been through all of these partners and it's still not fulfilling me. Oh, well, then just go further. And you'll find fulfillment further down the road. Eventually, what's further down the road is a big trap that you fall in and can't get out. And so many heartbreaking stories I've heard of people who have fallen in the trap. I mean, it looks really good to begin with, but it's a counterfeit. Right? It looks shiny, it looks beautiful, but it's counterfeit. It's disguised as light, but it's darkness. Satan disguises himself as an angel of light, verse 15, so it's no great surprise if his servants, the word there is ministers, it's no great surprise if his ministers also disguise themselves as ministers of righteousness. Wait a minute. Satan has ministers? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of them. Honestly, some of them are pretty dang nice guys. Some of the nicest guys I've met have been ministers of Satan. Now, you got to understand, Satan goes to one of two extremes. Either the guy's got tattoos all over and horns built into his head and little piercings all over, and he listens to noise that couldn't possibly be ever classified as music. And I'm pretty liberal in what I classify as music. And he's kind of nasty. Or maybe way nasty. Or it's the other extreme. There's the people that embrace it. That say, yes, I'm a Satanist. And they're weird and there's not that many of them by comparison of those who say, no, I'm not into anything evil or bad. Instead, they're into whatever false religion or whatever sect. I don't know how many of them I really want to call on the carpet tonight, but I've known some really good guys who wore orange robes and had bald heads, and they had a lot of nice things to say. I mean, some of the stuff sounded pretty good. But unfortunately, it's counterfeit. I've known some pretty nice guys that called themselves a pastor or a church leader or an elder. They sure seem like nice guys. And I do believe that they thought that they were doing the right thing. But they're so horribly deceived because Satan disguises himself not as a guy with horns and a tail. There's a famous story about a Scotsman who saw the picture of the temptation of Christ, which has a picture of Satan looking all, horns and tail and all that, talking to Jesus out in the desert. But of course, Jesus overcomes, right? And the Scotsman said, well, if he came to me looking like that, I wouldn't listen to him either. Well, it's the truth. He comes like an angel of light. And the only way you're going to know the difference between the counterfeit and the real is if you know what the real is. And that's what Paul is telling us. And then he says in verse 15, their end, these ministers of Satan, their end will be according to their works. In other words, they want to be rated based on these physical characteristics of how nice they are or how much money they give or whatever. They want to be rated based on their physical characteristics. In the case of these super apostles, how good their oration skills are, how many people follow them, how much money they raise. That's what they want to be rated on. They'll be rated on that. So when they stand before the great white throne of judgment and the books are opened and your and my name is in the book of life, we have trusted in Christ. We depend on Him at the moment. At that time, we're fully dependent on Him. So we're excused from the great white throne of judgment. We'll talk later at the Bema seat. But for now, it's just those whose name's not in the book of life, and they're standing before Christ, before God, the judge of all. And the books are open, and He looks down the list to see what they did and how well they stack up against the measure of righteousness that's required for eternal life, which, by the way, is in the Sermon on the Mount. And He says, so how'd you do? Oh, I see you raised a lot of money through your preaching. Oh, I see you always dressed well when you preached. That's good. Oh, I see you went to oration college. Good for you. Now here's the standard. Not even close. Excused. Off to the other place. Their end will be according to their works. The thing that this is really scary for is not the people who are in known defiance against Christ. And I know quite a few of them, and you probably do too. People who have at least some understanding of who Christ is and the fact that they should trust Him, but are choosing not to. I mean, that bothers me for those people. I can't even imagine, but I guess if that's what they're going to do, if they're going to give up this life and the next, I mean, we're not going to let them go easy. We're going to try to drag them to Christ. That's what we're going to try to do. But the people that it really scares me for are the people who think they're doing so well. They think they're earning their way in, like the rich young ruler. Oh, I've been tithing continuously and I've never missed Sunday school. That's nice, but is your name in the book of life? Their end will be according to their works. Now, if we read this just all the way through very quickly, you would find the picture that he draws of these false teachers to be pretty well violent, honestly. He hates these guys. These guys are messing with his kids. They're off there saying that the information that they've received about Christ is wrong, that it's got to be Jesus and, which is, by the way, how every heretical sect of Christianity starts. It's got to be Jesus and. Jesus alone, not good enough. It's got to be Jesus and. And like we said, Paul is very afraid of what's going to happen to these guys if they listen and go that way. Verse 16, he says, I repeat, let no one consider me a fool, But if you do, at least accept me as a fool so that I can boast a little. Let no one consider me a fool, but if you do, at least accept me as a fool so I can talk about myself for a minute. What I'm saying in this matter of boasting, I don't speak as the Lord would, but as it were foolishly. I don't speak as the Lord would. In other words, don't blame the Lord for my talking about myself. Don't say, well, look at this guy, Jesus, that you've put together. And that's good, because how often do people blame Jesus for their own big mouth? Well, the Lord told me to tell you. I just want to pray for you in this, sister. Or how about this one? Pastor comes and says, hey, will you help me with this thing or this project? Well, let me pray about that, Pastor. When somebody tells me that, I know what that means. That means, no, you don't want to, but you're unwilling to say you don't want to, and you want to blame it on Jesus. Yeah. He says, nope, this is me. I am doing the talking here. I'm going to do the boasting. Verse 18, since many boast according to the flesh, I will also boast. Since you are into fleshly credentials, I will tell you my fleshly credentials, he says. Now, what do you expect here for fleshly credentials? Well, he's going to talk about his education, what school he went to, the grades he got. He's going to talk about the work that he did at the temple before he became a Christian. He's going to talk about his seat on the Sanhedrin, which is still a lifetime appointment. Other than the fact that they want to kill him, he should still have that seat. He's going to talk about all of the churches that he planted, right? Maybe he's been keeping track of all the believers that got converted under his ministry, so he can give you a number of all the people that came to Christ. That's what he's going to talk about, right? No. Since many boast according to the flesh, I will also boast. This is kind of funny. For you, being so wise, gladly put up with fools. Another little injection of sarcasm there. In fact, you put up with it if someone enslaves you, if someone exploits you, if someone takes advantage of you, if someone is arrogant toward you, if someone slaps you in the face. He's not just talking out of the side of his mouth. This is how these teachers treated the people. This is how they acted toward them. One very long time ago commentator says, this verse gives us an unexpected and painful glimpse of the enslaving. Take a look at Galatians 2:4 for that. Greed-loving, like Matthew 23:14. Gain-hunting, like 1 Peter 5:2 and 3. Domineering, like 3 John 9. And even personally violent and insulting character of these teachers. Enslaving, greed-loving, gain-hunting, domineering, and personally violent. When these teachers would come around, they would demand money, and then they would begin to speak to the people. And if they didn't feel like someone was listening or responding in the way they thought they should, they would yell at them. And I don't mean like, get louder from the pulpit. I mean like come down face to face, nose to nose, and yell at them for being a stupid idiot because they didn't understand and weren't responding appropriately. And if the person still did not respond appropriately, they would punch them with the fist or slap them in the face. This was common practice. This is what the rabbis did. Now, to these Greek believers who were mostly lower class, that's just Tuesday. People hit them and slapped them and knocked them around all the time. They were pretty used to it. So when Paul came being so loving and caring, that was kind of weird. Somebody's being nice to us. These guys come and say, you stupid slave, you don't even have the brains to understand what I'm talking about, and knocked them upside the head. They're like, okay, I understand now. I get it now. You can have my money. This is the way they were being treated. Paul's argument here when he says, I say this to our shame, verse 21, we've been too weak for that. His sarcastic argument here is essentially, when we came, we showed you how it's supposed to be done. You're to be led gently, like a shepherd leading his sheep. You're not to be, the teacher is not to be domineering or argumentative with you or physically violent with you. It's always a difficult situation, particularly with young ladies, girls in their mid-teens into their mid-20s. When they're hanging around an abusive guy, they're just so loyal to him. well, he really loves me, and well, you should see the way he treats me the other times. And no, he doesn't. He doesn't. And he doesn't have any right to treat you like that. Oh, but he buys me such nice stuff, and he treats me so well. No. I feel like this is what Paul's doing with these guys. These teachers are being physically, emotionally, and spiritually abusive. And you're welcoming them in. Oh, have you come to beat me up some more? Have you come to yell at me and slap me in the face and swear at me? Oh, come on in. That's what these teachers were doing to them. Paul says sarcastically, forgive me that I'm too physically weak to slap you in the face. Because they know Paul would never do that. They know he would never treat them that way. Oh, we don't have much time. But in whatever anyone dares to boast, I'm talking foolishly here, I also dare. So the things they say about themselves, I can also say. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. This is what those people were claiming. We don't know specifically, but he's saying, hey, if they can claim it, I can claim it just as easily, which, of course, we know he was. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. 23, are they servants of Christ? He says, now I'm talking like a madman. He says, now I am acting as though I am certifiably insane. This is not something somebody should say. They say they're servants of Christ. Well, if I'm going to be really crazy about it, I'm a better one than them. How is he a better one than them? Because of all of the converts that have happened up in his ministry? No, but because of the price he's paid. I'm a better one with far more labors, many more imprisonments, far worse beatings, and many times near death. They've not experienced those things. I have. Paul is saying that if you want to see how well I've served, he says, look at the enemies I've made along the way. We have this impression that Christianity ought not be looked down upon. We have this impression that Christians ought to be the most well-respected people in society. And that when the wise Christian man speaks, everyone should hush and listen. Now, there was a time in the American culture for a brief period of time where that was kind of sort of true, but that's been the only time. Throughout history, the people who speak on behalf of Christ have been the people who are most persecuted, most abused, most misunderstood, most abandoned, paid the highest price. Because you think about Christ and you think about the enemies that he made along the way. Well, if we're with him, we're going to make the same kind of enemies. We're going to make enemies of the religious institutions. We're going to make enemies of people who claim to be God followers but are not. We're going to make enemies of public institutions. We're going to make enemies of the government. Oh, we're not trying to. Jesus wasn't out trying to. Compared to these guys who were so abusive, Isaiah tells us Jesus wouldn't break a bruised reed or snuff out a smoldering wick. He didn't ever go looking for a fight, but the fight always came to him. They were always arguing with him because he said things like grace and love, and that just doesn't work in modern culture. And when the culture is loaded with counterfeits, when the real thing comes, there's a problem. Imagine if somebody gave you 11 counterfeit $100 bills. Pardon me, 10 counterfeit $100 bills and one real one. So you had $1,100. One of those bills is real. 10 of them are fake. Now, each of the fake ones looks slightly different. And each of them looks slightly different from the real one. And you're not sure which one the real one is. Which one do you think the person presenting them to you is going to want to remove? The real one. Of course, that's the only one with value. The other ones are just fake. And if they can get the real one out of the way, you're going to be so confused about what is real, you'll take whatever comes along. And this is what the devil is doing with Christianity and Christian people. If you are the real thing, then it's going to be a struggle. You know, China doesn't have a problem with the Christian church. Well, at least not the ones that they promote. The ones that don't preach the Bible as we have it. They don't have a problem with them. Fine. You see what I'm saying? This is what Paul's saying. I guess we're going to have to stop there. That's a really rough time to stop because now we get into all of the things that happened to Paul, and that's pretty interesting. But we'll come back to that next time. We'll just pick it up right there, and we'll go right into chapter 12, which is a great chapter. Let's stop and pray. Lord, I thank you that you care so much for us. I thank you for your tremendous grace for us. I thank you for giving us the truth. And I pray, O Lord, that we would know it and understand it and present it, and that we would take seriously this that you've given us. In Jesus' name, amen.